I would like to acknowledge that QUESCREN is committed to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Today's presentation deals with the history curriculum, and I know Raphael has looked not only at how official language minorities are included in the writing process, but also Indigenous peoples. So it's important to work in collaboration with Indigenous communities to form mutual and ongoing relationships, but also because there's a long history of misrepresentation. And if you want to know more about that in terms of Indigenous people, I highly recommend Catherine Larochelle's L'école du racisme, la construction de l'altérité à l'école québécoise, which won the top literary award from the Institut d'Histoire d'Amérique française last year. Excellent book. This event is made possible through the financial support of the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise. QUESCREN also receives funding from the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Canadian Institute for Research on Linguistic Minorities, and Concordia University. Please note that this is a space for intellectual exchange. Any views or opinions expressed in this talk do not necessarily represent those of QUESCREN or its founders. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our esteemed speaker for today, Dr. Raphaël Gani, coming to us live from London, England. Raphaël Gani is an assistant professor of history education at Université Laval, whose projects link educational rights, school curricula, and the concept of legitimacy. His thesis, recent QUESCREN Research Brief, and upcoming edited volume with Jerôme Gosselin-Tapp address these links.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to QUESCREN Lunch and Learn, titled 3 Approaches to Writing School Program with Official Language Minorities. As we show now on the picture, are tables and chairs, and it's at Université Laval, where I work as a professor of history education since 2022. It's a significant place for me to start this presentation because this is where I met a long dear colleague of mine, David Scott, in 2013 to discuss a novelty in the Alberta curriculum. So at that time, we sit on these chairs and at one of a table, and he said to me, Raphael, we have this new curriculum in Alberta that asks us to teach about Francophone perspective. And as him, he was a doctoral student, but also a history educator back then. He was like, I'm in charge of training pre-service teacher to go on with this curriculum. And we don't really know what Francophone perspective is. Can you help us? You're from Quebec, you probably know. So I couldn't really say much to his demand at first, but what intrigued me is I was like, to say the least, shocked, because I say, what Francophone perspective in Alberta? Being raised in Quebec, all I heard about Alberta through my socialization was like, Alberta is anti-Quebec, anti-sovereignist, there's difficulty for French speaker there, that's where French speaker go there to assimilate. I heard that through media, through different means. And I'm like, how come Francophone perspective have now to be learned in social study for all students in Alberta from kindergarten to grade 12? So I went on to go and try to find an answer to that. That will lead me to compare Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec. But first, let's start with Alberta. How come Francophone perspective got to be mandated in that provinces? And I found this quote through the archive, so I'm going to read it to you. If we look for balance, it's because the social tenor of our time cries out for it. We're not making it up. It's reality. The multicultural group that were marginalized are mad as hell. We see that everywhere. Not too long ago, she said, she's a curriculum designer who participates in the Alberta program. An Anglophone programmer will make up a curriculum and then send it to native and Francophone educator for comment. But now we all sit down at a table together with a blank paper in front of us and make a curriculum together. Is that bad? So we have to reframe that in the context of at the end of the 90s, there was a curriculum innovation in the Western Canada where all provinces got together with Northern territories to create a common social study curriculum that was the hub for innovation. And because usually programs for schools are made through silos in provinces and territories since 1867. That's what the original Constitution of Canada afforded. But now, in the 1990s, for different reasons, such as student mobility across provinces, what happened is they got together create a curriculum and included for the first time in Canadian history, Francophone representative and Indigenous representative at the curriculum table to write the curriculum together as equal partners. So let's see a graphic representation of what it looked like. So what I mean by a table is a place where decisions are made. What I mean by the curriculum is the sheet of paper that you see there is state-sanctioned document that prescribe to teacher what students have to learn and when. What I mean by the table is those people who are supposedly by the government mandated to write the curriculum. And here we have linguistic majority representative on one side, linguistic minority representative, Francophone on the other side, and Indigenous, all sitting at the table in Alberta at the end of the 1990s to write a curriculum together. So that's what I call the partnership approach. Each of these representatives hold the pen and decide what students need to learn. What does it do concretely? These people sat down together, and one of the major gains was for Francophone and Indigenous. I'm going to focus more on Francophone here because it's on official language minority, the presentation. Social study and Francophone perspective and experience. That's an excerpt from the curriculum, social study, which is mandated from kindergarten to grade 12 in Alberta. So for historical and constitutional reason, an understanding of Canada requires an understanding of Francophone perspective, of Francophone experience, that Francophone students have particular needs and requirements. So since 2005, that's what it's supposed to be taught in school, and teacher has the autonomy to adapt the mandate and to find the adequate pedagogy for it. So as you might wonder, why is this historical and constitutional reason, but it's not defined in the curriculum. So that's why I had to go in the judiciary archive to find one of the famous judgment in official language and minority literature, the Mahé judgment in Alberta, written by Judge-in-Chief Dixon in 1990 about Section 23. So as I said before, curriculum are made by provinces and territory. That's why you have a wide array and style and way to write curriculum and the content. However, Ministry of Education have to abide to Section 23 of the Charter of Right and Freedom since 1982, which said basically in Section 23 that Francophone have access and control over elementary and secondary school, but the interpretation of that section by judges extended its reach. So here I'm going to read what Judge Dixon say. Finally, it should be noted that the management and control accorded to Section 23 parent does not preclude provincial regulation. The province has an interest both in the content and the qualitative standard of educational program. Such program can be imposed without infringing Section 23, insofar as, and it's very important, they do not interfere with the linguistic and cultural concern of the minority. So when in the curriculum they refer to constitutional reason and their interpretation, my basic intuition is they took into account, they being the Minister of Education, account into Section 23 and its implication, which means the ministry can impose a program to the minority, but it has to fit to a certain degree their cultural and linguistic concern. So we're going to see here in Alberta, we see one model. In one way, they decide to include a representative at the table, the partnership approach. We're going to see that that approach is a bit different in Ontario and then in Quebec. Let's look at the Ontario model. So again, met in a cafeteria with one of my colleague at University of Ottawa, where I did my thesis, Marie-Hélène Brunet, which very interested in comparing version of the curriculum in history and world study. And so she asked me, would I want to participate? First of all, I didn't know that there were different versions of the same curriculum in Ontario. So then again, she asked me to look into and compare those two curriculum to work with her, but I was way more interested in finding out why there was these two versions. So basically, when you look at the curriculum, they share about 80% of the same content, but 20% is different in the French version, and then 20% is different in the English version. So why? How come, which is a bit different in Alberta and Quebec, why this happened in Ontario? went again in the archive, find an interview with Geneviève Roy, which is a top bureaucrat in the 1990s, which helped her and her team to implement a specific way to make curriculum in Ontario. So I'm going to read her word. For this social study framework program, speaking about the one published in 1998, at the same time as this process was being carried out on the French side, the same process was being carried out on the English side. The manager on the English side and I met to ensure consistency between the two programs. There was an English language advisory committee, also similar to ours, with which acted as liaison to ensure input also from the minister office. So I just translate her word. It was in French originally. What she say here is very interesting. So basically, the way they did the program, and they will do this afterward, is they created two tables in which, in one table, Francophone control the pen, the way what is going to be prescribed to student, and then the Anglophone, the same. Indigenous representation will also be assured on these table, and therefore they work separately, but also in collaboration to ensure that 80% of the curriculum was shared, but also there are some discretionary content to fit and abide to the needs of the official language minority or the majority. So how does it play it out graphically is here you have two tables with Indigenous going in consultation with both, but also have some leverage to control what will be included in the curriculum. And each of these tables control about 20% of the curriculum, and then they work together to fit and have this 80% common. So if I'm trying to synthesize, because it's very important, the difference between Alberta and Quebec. So basically, each student in Alberta going to public school should get about 80% of the same content in history. But however, 20% will be a bit different in Francophone school, and 20% will be a bit different in Anglophone school. What does it do in concrete? What in the curriculum, this power, this discretionary power that I told you about, what does it lead to? As you might not know, the Rapport Durham, the Durham report, famous report that came out after the rebellions, the Patriot rebellions in Quebec, 1837, 1838. What happened is Durham report appeared, talk about the way in which French Canadian have no culture, no history, and therefore they need to be assimilated. That's the way, anyway, it has been again and again told in school or in the curriculum. But what's important is when you compare the French and English version, you see a bit of a difference. In the French version, I'm going to say it in English, you can read it in French, but they really emphasize that the conclusion of Lord Durham was really tailored to say that French Canadian did not have history nor culture, and therefore they needed to be assimilated. Was that legitimate, they asked? So teacher here have some liberty to interpret that in Francophone school. Look at the way it is presented, the same report. It's the only mention here about the Rapport Durham in both of these. So in English, it says, how would you characterize French-English relation at the time of the Durham report? No question of, for instance, assimilation, nor lack of history and culture. So we see here that those who hold the pen, Francophone, made sure to pass a certain message. We can argue whether it's the right or wrong message, but we can see that the discretionary power that they hold at the curriculum table translate and is being transposed in the curriculum to different way to problematize Lord Durham report. Why, again, could we explain why these two tables were created? It's not only Geneviève Roy, there was a particular zeitgeist to it. Again, my basic intuition is that Ontario Minister of Education took notice of Section 23, which again, I showed this sentence, which basically act as my leverage in my research right now, which basically say that not only the Minister of Education have the responsibility to produce a program or curriculum for a student, but they have to attend specifically if they want to be in regulation with Section 23. These curriculum have to fit somehow, some way with the needs, cultural and linguistic concern of the official language minority. Therefore, I think that part of the leverage that could explain why these two tables were created is related to Section 23 because it constrained Minister of Education to act in a certain way and to hear, but not only hear, but make sure that the minority can have their interest in the curriculum. You might ask, as I told you the story at the beginning, I told you about David Scott and, got interested in Alberta. Why did you bite on that? Why didn't you stay in Quebec? It was 2013, after all. There was a big history war in Quebec. By history war, I mean there was big debate over the reform of the curriculum by the Parti Québécois. Here we see the picture of Marie Malavoie, which was the Minister of Education at that time, who was piloting the reform. And it was an electoral promises that they made. So they went along, and what they did in the first step, and it's usually not told, that story. I've read recently Jacques Beauchemin, which was a heavy part of that reform, not referring to it, but that got me actually away and turned my back for a time on Quebec. What's that story? Is that Sub-Minister Alain Veilleux created a group for the reform of the history of Quebec and Canada curriculum, which is mandated for secondary 3 and secondary 4, made up of educationalists, academic and historian of all stripes, both French and English, including woman history specialist Micheline Dumont, McGill professor Paul Zanazanian, and educationalist and novelist Jean-Pierre Charlin. Half of the committee, 10 members, are members of the Coalition pour l'Histoire, which is well known for criticizing the current program, which it claimed leave out parts of Quebec national history. That program being the one implemented since 2006. What happened after the creation of that subcommittee with a plurality of voice, which it was dissolved? Basically, it was argued that these people that held so pluralist view that they cannot never arrive at a consensus, and therefore a table was formed with a sociologist, Jacques Beauchemin, and historian, Nadia Famiyid. I'll let you reflect on the fact that there was no educational people on that committee, and they decided to exclude notably one of the Anglophone representative, being my mentor and dear friend, Paul Zanazanian, and therefore Anglophone were not sitting at the table no more, representative, but they held the position as consultant. And that went along with the creation of the program that was officially implemented in 2017. Contrasted to Alberta and Ontario, I could not find interview with curriculum designer. If you read the curriculum, you'll see there it's not authored. We don't know who did it and how, and it's not in the literature neither. So I had to do requests of access of information. That means you have to ask the Minister of Education to disclose information not publicly available to find out that it was Sylvain and Marie-Hélène, Sylvain Bilodeau and Marie-Hélène, I forget her last name, but they were responsible basically to create the curriculum and what I deduced to be a part of the linguistic Francophone majority. There was also in that document obtained ways in which the curriculum was produced. So Anglophone were not totally out. They were part of consultation committee. Here I put a list. Maybe there's some of you who are part of these institutions on the back. So they were consulted, Commission scolaire anglophone du Québec, Association provinciale des enseignants et enseignantes du Québec, Association des écoles privées du Québec. So Anglophone representative in those were consulted during the process. And I will put an article soon, it's in writing, to show, because I have analyzed their demand and the way the ministry responded. Most of their demand were refused. Some of them were accepted, but most of them were refused. But what's important for my point is they did not hold the pen. They were consulted, they could voice their concern, but actually it's, and in the end, very different from Ontario and Alberta, they were not holding the pen. It was Francophone representative from the linguistic majority that decide what went on and not in the curriculum. So here's the graphic representation of what it looked like. Here in Quebec, contrary to Ontario and Alberta, Francophone Anglophone minority and Indigenous minority doesn't hold the pen. There's some exception with Indigenous with some treaty relation with the Cree, for instance, but for others community, they do not hold the pen to write the curriculum. So basically they have to go see the majority, be consulted, but the majority could decide for various reasons not to include. It's a very different approach than Ontario and Alberta. as you see, what this lack, if we might say, or different, if we want to be more objective, different types of representation at the table, the curriculum table, what did it do? As you might know, I will not go into detail, but since the publication of the curriculum, but even while it was written, many Anglo-Quebecers, English-speaking communities member, were asking for a better representation of their community and also Indigenous people in various communities in the Quebec history curriculum. You could see that in a master thesis, Michael, in presentation at the Vitality Forum, QUESCREN by Moisan, in a survey by Green, open letter by Cummings, brief submitted to the public consultation held by Beauchemin and Famille Eve, in media, in Le Devoir, in CBC, in a report, from the Advisory Board on English Speaking Education, from Bradley and Allison in a journal article, and from English Montreal School Board in a report that basically say, as one example, that it's very difficult to identify yourself as English speaking and see yourself in that curriculum. You're represented, there's lacks of representative of the plurality of the community, as they look like conqueror and not like necessarily working class people, similar to Francophone. So we can see directly, and we can go in the question period. I'll be gladly answering your question about why it's so important. There are many other reasons why it's important for the Anglophone community, the official language minority, and also Indigenous representative to sit at the table, not only being consulted, but holding the pen. Because as we see in Quebec, it causes as a lot of resistance or a lot of interrogation from the community because they find themselves misrepresented. And my basic intuition is if you look back at the story of why, it's because they were not including at the table. I'm going to end up this presentation with my brief. So this was a synthesis of my QUESCREN Research Brief that you can find in the discussion section later on in this talk and in the QUESCREN website. So I could talk to you about what went on in writing that sentences, which was quite a ride, but I think it's important to give it the final voice, and therefore summarizing what I've been trying to argue all along during that talk. So Anglophone in Quebec have the right to a program that adequately represents their perspective and concerns. Existing jurisprudence relating to Section 23 in the Charter of Rights and Freedom and program writing approaches enacted in Ontario and Alberta support this point. Given this, the government of Quebec may want to consider following the example of other provinces and take proactive measures to enhance the input of his English-speaking minority in Quebec history education program development. Thank you.
Sylvia Martin-Laforge, QCGN, wrote, it's a difference of perception. In other provinces, linguistic diversity is not seen, I guess she's saying, is not seen as a threat, but as a valuable contribution, whereas in Quebec, it's seen more as a threat, given the status of French in Quebec. So do you have any comments to say on that, Raphael?
I think if you look back at the history of why there's one single curriculum in Quebec, it's very important. I think it's kind of put in perspective the threat issue. Because if you look, it's basically after the Rapport Parent in the 1960s, notably the history program, it was advocated that it was not really scientific to have different programs to teach the same scientific discipline, which was history. You had Catholic program, Anglo, Franco, Protestant. So it was argued back then to basically create one single program for all students because, not because of a threat, but because it was more scientific. It shows that the discipline of history is more scientific. And therefore, what we see since then is that what it created is basically the condition for the Francophone to be in charge of holding the pen to write the curriculum. And as we saw, it's not necessarily a fatal flaw because in other provinces, it was done also by the majority. But through the year, I think there's an interaction with Section 23 that is very different in Quebec than in other provinces. And maybe that helped other people, that's my basic intuition, Alberta and Ontario, to kind of ease their way and bring back the official language minority in the process at the curriculum table. Whereas, as we know, and we could discuss that further, we have a complicated history in Quebec with the Charter of Right and Freedom. However, we see recent gain in the jurisprudence, notably on Bill 21 and Bill 40, that show that the judges interpret the control and management of the community to imply way more than just access to school. And I could argue in more if we push it, maybe that implies some right to be at the curriculum table.
There's a few more questions. I have one. I have the million-dollar question here. What is the best approach for Quebec? Now, obviously, you suggesting that the current approach, where Quebec does not have a seat at the table, does not have a pen, is not the best. But which one is better for Quebec? On the Ontario approach, where you have two separate curriculums, or the Alberta approach, where you have an integrated curriculum? And I know in our conversations, you mentioned in the past that the Alberta approach did kind of backfire at one point. So there are some issues there. Maybe you can talk a bit about that.
So through writing this brief, this come up as, am I an engaged caller trying to, advocate for one particular best answer? Well, that's not really my role. My role, and to answer directly your question, the best approach is a comparative approach. First of all, is to be aware that different types of curriculum are made, that there's not a single way to make curriculum. When I hear community leaders, when I hear what is advocated in the community, I don't necessarily see references to other models very precisely to say it is done elsewhere in different way, maybe that could apply to us. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and it's a thing I will continue trying to work with QUESCREN with, is Section 23 literacy. My friend and colleague, Anthony Damasio from Bishop, we have long discussion about the way the community protected himself in education realm for a long time with Section 93 from the original Constitution that protected Protestant rights in Quebec. I know there's some Catholic Anglophone, but they use that leverage to protect their right from schooling. But since, I think, 1997, when this conventionalization of school got disrupted, now it's more Section 23. And it's very interesting that recently, just only recently, Anglophones start to have some gain using Section 23. So I will say literacy about Section 23 to not only understand that it gives rights to the community access and management of their school, but it might also be used potentially, that's what I'm arguing, about the way in which it could justify a place at the curriculum table. To answer more directly in terms of which model and what model create what. So it's true that in Alberta, they bring a Francophone representative. I'm going very simplistically, but they bring a Francophone representative. He makes sure to include Francophone content. And what I've noticed in my thesis, and there was some kind of resistance, if we say politely, from a lot of Albertan who was like, why these community, Francophone community, they see this as privilege, why we have to learn about that. They're not necessarily present in the West. So you have to remember that program was implemented in 2005. And I've analyzed public consultation on that program from its moment of creation to now, because now it's in reform. Over 20 years, what I've observed is that resistance has diminished. So I think the curriculum start to make ground. Before, what I mean is there were lots of resistance and you find very few support saying it's legitimate to basically put Francophone there. But the curriculum was implemented, it did its thing, and now there's a reform. And I got some data from recent public consultation that show that Albertans are now more sympathetic to the representation of official language minorities. So my answer is some model, there's no magic solution. It takes times, but it showed that if the minority is at the table, they better have chance to include representation, I might say fair representation of themselves. And to convince the majority, it will take time. It will not happen overnight, but there's some evidence from Alberta, of all the places. I remember Alberta, if you know how we've been socialized in Quebec to see them. There seems to be now Francophone perspective being part of the conversation. I take as evidence the last report from the Minister of Education, who launched a new round of consultation, making sure that Francophone perspective will be heard and be included, which is a sign that they're part of the conversation and the word Francophone perspective is discussed 20 years after it was first drafted in the curriculum boxes.
Thank you, Raphael. So we don't know whether Ontario or Alberta is better at this point. Both. So I see there's Sylvia made some comments, and I think we're a small group. Maybe we can. I'll let her verbalize those comments. So Sylvia, if you can unmute yourself and perhaps, because I know Sylvia was involved with the curriculum in Ontario.
Intimately involved. So in Ontario, there was, I don't know, I've been gone for a long time. There was a decision by the Ministry of Education over 20 years ago now, and I was part of that decision to have a very very strong French language education branch. And in that French education branch, there was the continuum. It was not only elementary, secondary, but post-secondary. I was not in charge of curriculum because that's not my bailiwick. I was in charge of programs more generally, and the funding coming in from the feds to support what was happening in Ontario's French language schools. And while I was there, Harris at the time gave French language schools, gave the governance to French language schools. So I lived all of that, and the French language universities and the colleges and universities. So I get it. So what was fascinating there, and when I came to Quebec, I had trouble with this, and many of you know this, there was curriculum that was unique, like, la mise en forme, stuff that is the same for everybody. There was modified, as Raphael, you mentioned, and then there was specific to francophones. Il y a encore l'aménagement linguistique. And so French language schools have a very particular role in helping students understand French language, their minority status in Ontario, and being proud of being a minority language person. So the Franco-Ontarian flag, there's a whole culture and responsibility from in the schools to promote this fierté d'être franco-ontarien. And it's the same pretty much in other provinces, not as strong because Franco-Ontarians are the biggest representation. So I'd like, that was, and so curriculum is terrifically important. And when we see movements in Franco-Ontarian land, it's and they fight against losing their universities, they fight against this, they fight against, that is all le foyer, le momentum, le foyer d'intérêt in your minority status, and being proud of your minority status comes from the schools. And I think that's what we're missing here. And we don't have, I think Lorraine and I once went to an event, I won't say where, and we asked English young people or people who are going to be teachers in Quebec, in one of the two education departments, do you promote the fact, or do you understand or promote the fact, I can't remember the words, Lorraine, that you're teaching minority students? And oh my God, nobody wanted to answer us, as I recall, Lorraine. So there's a whole context around curriculum and the importance that curriculum plays in the vitality of the English-speaking community. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Sylvia. So less of a desire in Quebec to promote an Anglo-Quebec identity than for Franco-Ontarians. Do you have any comments to say on that, Raphael? No? Okay. So we have a question from Shannon Bell. She says, I'm curious if you have any other examples of curriculum differences you could share with us, like the Durham report example. So in Ontario, are there any other interesting examples of differences between the French and English curriculum that jumped out at you?
That's interesting, because the differences are played out not only in history, but my girlfriend, but also professor at University of Bishop, Joanne Patterson-Meek, is working on the difference in the geography. So that might get us a bit, I only talk really about history and social study, but there's geography, and she's looking at this difference right now. And interestingly speaking, the geography seems to be more tailored to the rural aspects of the population presence in the rural area of Ontario, versus in the English, it's more brought aside. And therefore it shows, and one of the explanations is maybe because part of the population of Francophone are in rural area. And it's very important from that community to teach their student about how and the way in which their presence on the land is affected by where they are, whether they're in a city or whether they're in rural. I remember driving back and forth to Ottawa and always stopping at Castleman, a village between Montreal and Ottawa. It's very strong Francophone present, and it explained maybe compared to a city why the French fact could resist more here through assimilation. So this is another example that I can tell you. We got many more. We have published an article on that, me and Marie-Hélène Brunet. That's easily found on, if you Google Marie-Hélène Brunet, Raphaël Gani, and we show a series of examples in there about the history curriculum that basically, usually it's a problematization issue. For the conquest, for instances, they will talk about, a bit like Durham report, when they talk about 1759 conquest, the plain of Abraham, they will go in the French curriculum and say how this conquest have sealed the destiny of Francophone in North America. Whereas in the English version, if I remember by memory, it's more like, again, this our relation between English or French or a different group were around the time of the conquest. So we see that the curriculum designer, and we can discuss whether it's legitimate or not, there's many different interpretations, not just seal the destiny, but again, it shows that their power to control the pen, the curriculum pen, they could actually tweaked it a bit the way the mandate was to the conquest, to more attuned to popular memory of Francophone about how the conquest is seen as this event where Francophone basically started from declining. So these are different examples, and we continue working on that. There's different example of, so you see, there's always a common ground. They will both talk about the conquest. So to go back to your comment, Patrick, I think it seems to be a model of, if I go back to the Canadian ideal of compromise, it seems to be, in a curriculum term, not so far from being middle ground and win-win, where student will learn about the conquest in Anglo and Francophone land and Indigenous, and be included in that, but there's specific angles to it that are suggested to teacher. So for some people who are a bit scared to create like that, like community and silo that learn different history, I think the Ontario curriculum seems to propose more of the middle ground. That's how far I can go on this.
Right. But on the other hand, you are teaching two different narratives to two different populations, so it may not create more social cohesion. That would be a counter argument, but And
I'll just jump in and say that the basis of my question was a little bit coming from the idea of, is there nuance between the Franco-Ontarian or like any Francophone from the rest of Canada? Are they having a different experience as far as the history that they grow up with, having lived outside of Quebec and not grown up with the sort of Quebec-specific rhetoric? I was just wondering if there was some nuance into the way that the history stories were told outside of Quebec, or if you had come across anything like that. But very, very specific question.
If I jump back to Alberta, like this is a question, that's one of the #1 question that English-speaking teacher in Alberta will ask is there such a thing, if I understand correctly your question, is there such a thing as a Francophone perspective? Do they live a certain reality? Well, when you do the history of Alberta, you kind of notice that the first colonial language that was spoken was French. There was certain specific relation with Indigenous. There was residential schooling, but there was also a particular presence to the land. And there were particular law after 1905 that restricted the experience and the capacity of Francophone to share their perspective, because basically it was made all English. So if those people can talk with nuance about Francophone perspective, like in Francophone circle, I don't really know. I think there's a tendency to just reassure that Francophone students know about themselves and know that they have a long-lasting existence in the province. That's their first mandate, and to make sure that they understand that they have rights. So these are not necessarily places where they're nuanced, but I think the way the curriculum are framed in Ontario and in Alberta give place to nuance, because the mandate is actually to answer some types of question. What were the perspective are? Instead of Quebec, which is very different, they have to learn bullet point facts, learn Lord de Ram, Lord de Conquest. Whereas in Ontario and Alberta, it gives place for a teacher to adapt and bring nuance, because the mandate is actually to help students answer question, which then could be, brought forward with different types of answers.
Right. We have a question from Tino Bordenaro of the Advisory Board on English Education. Given the recent Superior Court decision regarding Bill 40, does this change things? I mean, will this ruling have an impact on curriculum development for Quebec's minority communities? Or does it have greater impact? Does it change anything? Or is May enough?
No, it's not enough. There was Arsenault Cameron after that, and there was other, and I'm aware of judgment on curriculum, but based on Section 93, so that's a different thing. So first thing first, it never been brought up to the Supreme Court of Canada, a curriculum question. My A cases didn't involve curriculum. It was a sidestep to the decision, which was really about control and management of school, basically creating school board and Arsenault Cameron funding of school. It's never been bring up to the court. Bill 40, control of school board. Bill 21, hiring or not of people with religious symbol. Because I will also include in Quebec, Bill 21, which also Juge Blanchard, previously to Bill 40, laid the ground. We saw in the last year or two, benchmark judgment by people in Quebec who start using, judges, Section 23 as the way, and I know more Bill 21, to argue, for instance, that since the Anglophone community judged that they want to hire people with religious symbol, they shouldn't be imposed by the majority, because Anglophone has the power to decide for their own, regardless of what the majority thinks. And Juge Blanchard did that in Bill 21. And I'm less familiar with Bill 40, but I've read it, pretty quickly to understand that they mobilized Section 23 to justify. So what does it imply? It's a buildup. But then the next question is, who's going to bring forward the question of the need for a place at the curriculum table? I show that in other provinces, it seems to have different models that work maybe, I wouldn't say better, but distinctively than from Quebec. And my official language minority have a very distinct place at the curriculum table and therefore in the curriculum. So if some people in the community are interested to do a build-up and then go on and ask the real question, and I'm going to ask you to people here, are you, if some people are right holder, are you a right holder entitled under Section 23 to have a seat, one of your representative, because we are in representative democracy, but one of the representative to have not only be consulted, but have a seat at the table and hold the pen to defend the interests of the community? Are you entitled as Section 23 holder? And depending on the answer to that, well, I think we might have some case, and actually building on the way judges recently seems to be more, they say, more liberal and on their interpretation of Section 23, and build on that to say, well, there may be a case for curriculum.
Okay, thank you. If anyone is interested in commenting or asking a question, please raise your hand virtually using the raise hand option at the bottom of the screen. I have another question. There are different kinds of Francophone representatives who could sit at a table, some with a sort of more narrow ethnic nationalist agendas, others who are more open to diversity, federalism. Who chooses the people who get to sit at the table? I know you mentioned the Sylvain and Marie-Hélène. What perspective do they represent? And who chose them to sit at the table?
Okay, so that's the big political philosophy question. I think I see maybe, people here identify as women might know this debate about who's representing women at the table. Anne Phillips in UK, I'm in the UK right now, wrote a book in 1989, if I'm not mistaken, in 1990. It's called Politics of Presence, that actually addressed this specific question. The question of representativity of the representative. And it's a never-ending debate. Like just in democracy, is it because a woman is elected that she will surely represent women interests? We know it's not. We know there's some problem. We know representative democracy is not necessarily the best, but the least of the worst avenue. So I think you're totally right, Patrick. It doesn't, having a seat at the table doesn't stop the conversation about who's represented. There's intersectionality there, who that person might be, and being able to represent. But in political philosophy, in politics of present, it has basically been argued, I think successfully on my part, that they need to be some kind of politics of presence. And per contrast to politics of idea, before we would argue ideas about whether women should be represented and whether it's good or not to have women at the table, or be like creating like equal, like what Trudeau is doing, like creating an equal number of ministers who are identify as men and identify as women. That's a politics of idea. What has been a major shift since the 70s is we basically start arguing and seeing evidence that actually people need to be at the table to be represented. But then, does the people always represent? Go back to the example. Am I represented right now by François Legault? Am I represented right now by people who I'm voting for? I'm not saying I'm voting for Legault, by the way. But then is basically a question of, is the issue. But what I'm saying is, bringing someone at the table at least bring a whole new sets of questions. But I will say to finish, we're not even there in the curriculum question in English-speaking Quebec. We're not even as because they're not there. They're not at the table. So we're not even in, oh, is this person representative? So I think once at the table, you're totally right. Question will arise about the English-speaking community are plural. There are many voices, but then at the table, it could be asked those questions and the conversation could continue. But at least if you're not on the table, that's a bit like in the cloud a bit, that question, I think.
Right. We have a comment from Lorraine and then Matt Russell. Lorraine?
It's a question, actually. Hi, Raphael. Thanks for a great talk. Could you give us more information? And I see Matt is next, and I think he might be able to weigh in on this too, about what is the problem? I mean, I think I know, but I'd like to hear more from you. When a population is not represented in the curriculum, how does that affect students and society more generally?
Well, okay, so I'm going to go back to George Day research, and I quoted by Tim Sten. I haven't talked, I'm going linguistic because official language minority, because the Charter of Rights protect, but I'm aware that there's racialized community, and I think give voice to these community also because they're part of the conversation. I mean, George Day and other, Tim Stanley and various people have shown how much racialized student might suffer from not having not only a curriculum that reflect them, but having a teacher that reflect them. And therefore it might impede and show higher rate of décrochage, higher rate also of failure in class. And I mean, if I'm talking about, again, trying to give voice to like LGBTQ community plus 2S, I mean, in Alberta, I've seen Canada research chair there, forget his name, but he's talking about if you don't see yourself reflecting on the walls, having the flag raised, you might feel less safe, right? You don't feel as you belong so much to the school. So these are all examples. I'm trying to broaden the conversation here to just answer your question, Lorraine, about what does it do when you don't feel represented? Well, it could bring a lot, apathy. It could bring not feel. But I guess what my sentiment and also what the research say, it impede learning, and it impede the capacity to belong to something. Whereas other might take that for granted because they've been talked to and represented. And I think we could argue, and I've seen some of your work you're doing with the history of English people in Quebec, how dear it's for you this idea that people need to find a way to belong, to identify, and not only see the Anglo as the conqueror, but as various people. And that's why it's important, is to feel you belong, and to feel you being part of the conversation. Being not part of the conversation, I think we know intuitively where it leads.
So just a follow-up comment. So thank you. It's interesting you're saying actual learning outcomes appear to be affected. And so an argument could be made possibly too that there are ultimately negative economic impacts of dropout and student, lower student success related to that. That's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a comment, a question or comment from Matt Russell. Matt, could you please introduce yourself and ask your question?
Sure. My name is Matt Russell, and I'm a pedagogical consultant at the Western Quebec School Board. And until recently, I was a classroom high school history teacher. So, Raphael, the data definitely shows that, the pass rate for English students in high school history in Quebec is lower than Francophones. We have that data, we know that. Anecdotally, from my own classroom, you see kids that turn off or ask questions. Paul Zanazanian's research also has shown that as well. Your talk was great because I was reflecting, and Tino's here as well, because we were involved in the piloting of the program. I'm not sure exactly how much we can say and if those confidentiality agreements we signed are still applicable. But Raphael, you're talking about who's at the table, right? And I was reflecting on those sessions that Tino and I were at, and those pilot teachers were like 80% white men. There was, I don't think there was anyone really, maybe one racialized person in the room, one or two at the most. And I think that that's really reflected in the curriculum as well.
I mean, yeah, that's refer back to what Patrick, what research I've shown, and thank you for bringing like the data on the history exam. I'm less aware of that data, and I mean, imagine if we can then compartmentalize the data to who the student is or who he identify as, because my intuition will be, like you said, the people who are not at the table, they're not represented in the curriculum, and then the student, strangely so, and I'm being ironic here, they don't see themselves, and then they have more chance of failure. And I don't like to calculate only failure by just the mark on the exam, because there's all kinds of issues. I think we can speak broadly about seeing yourself, being involved, being engaged in the classroom. And I mean, that doesn't surprise me. And I think the Ministry of Education, I mean, that was the original headlines of the talk. It can do better in Quebec. Not only thinking in linguistic terms, I've tried to bring more voices in the question period about, and Patrick's question was leaning, who's being represented and how can we make sure that we have a policy? Because I've been asking the minister to show me the policy of consultation, and I haven't have an answer. What kind of, and I think they're working on it, to be honest. I don't try to be too hard on them. But what kind of model do we have? And that's what I'm trying to work on. We have different models in different provinces. I can see them clearly, but here in Quebec, it's very difficult. What kind of model do we have for consultation? Besides saying we need an Anglophone historian and an advisory panel to be consulted on the curriculum. But what kind of model do we have to have a particular table with chairs that might bring more voice, but also at the end, and you make the case, Patrick, and I'm going to reel back, to bring more consensus also. But not consensus in terms of we all agree, but we can all have equivalent opportunity to see ourselves in the curriculum. They're not the same. It's not equal, but equivalent ways to, so there's certain, I see myself there, maybe not there, but at least we bring more voice in. And that's what I'm trying to work as a model. I don't know, I would like to speak more with the minister, but it's difficult. I had to make requests of access of information to know how they do these consultation. And what I found is their model seems to be consultative, but I'm totally agree. I mean, with Matt, voice at the table. I mean, and they were piloting. Let's not even talk about how, what kind of impact teacher are in the piloting on the curriculum. They're being consulted, but there's a whole thinking about, because the conversation is often how we are depicted in the curriculum. But I'm trying to have the contribution of, let's talk who was at the table, or like Matt was saying, who was represented in these consultations. to then start to find out, well, that may be explaining why representation occur in the curriculum.
Okay, thank you very much. It's 12:57, and this talk ends at 1, so I'm going to end with a few closing remarks. But first of all, thank you very much, Raphael, for an excellent and very engaging presentation. Thank you all for attending today's event. We always want to hear your feedback, and we invite you to fill out the evaluation form for today's Lunch and Learn. You will find the link in the chat. The link to the research paper will also be added to the chat. So if you want to read Raphael's research brief, it's a short 3-4 page document which sums up the research he presented today. Stay tuned for upcoming events in our Lunch and Learn series. The best way to learn about what is coming up in our programming is to sign up for our newsletter, and if you haven't already, or to follow us on Facebook or LinkedIn. And a few more links will be added there. And in November is our important biennial Education and Vitality Forum. So please check out the program and register. And another link will be added there. So there's a lot of links in the chat. Click on all of them. In closing, we acknowledge the financial support of the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise, Government of Quebec. QUESCREN also receives funding from the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Canadian Institute for Research on Linguistic Minorities, and Concordia University. I'd also like to thank Anna Hunt for organizing this event and for technical assistance today. Thank you again to Dr. Raphaël Gani and for you all attending, and we wish you all a great day. See you next time.